Well, hello and welcome to this webinar on cylinder management. My name is David Tyler and I'll be running the webinar for the next hour from London with Tamsin Donaldson supporting me from South Africa. So it's a good morning, a good day, good evening, wherever you are. But first of all, thank you very much for joining and registering for this. Those of you that have registered for the webinar will be able to access the recording afterwards. So we're going to record this next hour. So if you're wanting to go back and revisit some of the conversations, you'll be able to do that, or pass the recording on to some of your colleagues who haven't been able to join today. That's fine as well. We'll also, we're showing a few slides just to give a bit of background to this webinar before we start, and you're getting a copy of those slides as well. So what I'll do, first of all, is ask those of you who have got a microphone on, if you could please mute, because we're picking up a bit of background noise. But this is the format that we're going to be following over the next hour. I've got a couple of opening remarks from myself. Then I will present the guide that we published back in 2009 on cylinder management. So this is a document that's nearly 15 years old. But as you'll see in a minute, the LPG industry is quite old itself. It goes back to 1910, I think, when LPG was first produced off a refinery. So we're talking about an industry that's well over 100 years old. And actually, in the last 10 years, there hasn't been a great deal of change in the way we recommend handling and managing cylinders. So I'll be talking about briefly the content of the guide that was produced, and then we'll have some questions and answers from yourselves, and we have one or two people who are going to make comments from the key stakeholder perspective. We have a cylinder manufacturer, we have a company that actually is in the LPG cylinder business. We have a company that manufactures cylinder filling plant equipment, and we also have an association in Asia that will be talking about the importance of regulation. So hopefully we'll get some input from all of those people in the next hour, and we'll do that at the Q&A stage there. So a couple of opening remarks. First of all, the World Liquid Gas Association, for those of you that are not familiar with us, based in Paris, we have over 300 members worldwide, and we represent about 125 countries. So we have members operating in or active in about 125 countries. And they cover the full value chain from production of LPG right through to the shipping and distribution into the primary storage facilities, through the distribution channel to the consumer. And that includes equipment manufacturers, it includes organizations that are observer members of ours, and any other organization that has any sort of interest in the LPG industry is welcome as a member of ours. And we are all the time looking for new members. So if you're interested in joining, then pick up my email at the end of the webinar, and we'll certainly follow up. Now, the vision of the World Liquid Gas Association is to promote the use of LPG globally, to foster a safer, cleaner, healthier, and more prosperous world. That vision hasn't changed over the last few years. The 4 mission goals we now have 4. We used to have 3. The second one of those, safety and business improvement, this is the one that I look after, and this is the one where our webinar sits today. A couple of housekeeping rules. I've already mentioned muting if you're not speaking. This webinar is following the World Liquid Gas Association Code of Conduct, so we don't talk about market shares or pricing, and we keep that off the agenda completely. This is a generic discussion about how to look after cylinders. The webinar is recorded, as I mentioned, as the presentation material. And if you have questions, this is a workshop webinar, so if you have questions you want to ask at any time, please pop them in the Q&A box, and Tamsin will pick those up and alert me to those so we can bring you in. And the other thing I want to mention is that you probably received a Q&R. Well, hopefully you received a Q&R code over the last couple of days, linking you to a Slido poll. And the Slido poll, if you haven't seen that yet, then please take a screenshot of that QR code, or you can get onto slido.com and insert that number, 631-82327, and you will come straight into the cylinder management poll. And there you will see a question. This is the question. What do you consider to be the two most important rules when managing LPG cylinders? And there are 6 answers there. And what we'd like you to do is just pick what you think to be the 2 most important. And we've already had very good response from the poll. But if you haven't yet responded, then there's the QR code again. Just have a quick look at that. Get your phones out. Normally we say close your phones when we're having a meeting, but this time we're going to be saying keep your phones on, take a picture of that, and quickly go into that poll and answer that question. Now, the Good Industry Practice Guide webinar, this one that we're holding today, follows one that we held in May. And the one that we held in May was all about transferring product from ship to road tanker. And this was a very unusual operation. There are no international standards for it. So a guide was produced last year, and we had a 1-hour webinar on that topic. And at the end of that webinar, we had an exit poll, and we'll have an exit poll for this one as well. And it recommended that we have repeat webinars. So we look at other guides that we produced. And the recommendation was that we look at cylinder management. So that's the history. That's why we're here. And we'll be now talking about cylinder management. And this is the program. We have a number of other guides. We have, I think, about 15 guides in all. And there is an opportunity to interrogate many of those in the future. So make a comment at the end of this webinar if you wish to do that, and pick one of the topics that you think would be of use for you. Before we go any further, the guide that we're going to be reviewing today is on that first link. So you will get this presentation, so you can rest assured that you can access this later on. It's a sizable document, and we hope that it's going to be of use for everybody, and we'll be discussing it today. And here we go into the guide, and let's go back to the beginning of the 1900s when LPG was first discovered. And there was a patent issued for it in 1913. So it is a very, very old industry. But one thing that's not changed very much over those years has been the design of the cylinder. If you look at a cylinder back in the 1920s, 1930s, it doesn't actually differ very much to the ones that we're operating with now. There are about, to our best estimate, 2 billion LPG cylinders in circulation globally. That would account for about $50 billion of assets. And it is a chunk of assets that we want to look after, we want to maintain, and we want to make sure it's in a good, safe, fit for purpose state. And this is what we'll be discussing: how to do that. How can we make those cylinders last? How can we ensure that they are recycling in the business and providing the customer with the assurance that they require? Interestingly, with the LPG business, I've said this a few times, is that the packaging of our product is actually worth more than the content. If you think about that, we're not dealing with a bar of chocolate that we throw the wrapper away. We're dealing with a cylinder where the cost of that cylinder is more expensive than the content inside it. And not only that, that wrapper, that package gets recycled many, many times. So we are indeed looking at a topic that is extremely important in the context of the proposition that we have. We need to ensure that those cylinders that are in circulation are not only safe, but they last a long time. Now, before we get into the topic in the guide itself, just have a quick look at this cylinder here. I can give you a clue. It was from Brazil. It was made, this photograph was given to me about a couple of months ago. And the question is, what year was the cylinder made? And how many times do you think it's been refilled in its life? And mentally, you can think of a number, but I can tell you that this cylinder is about 60 years old. It was manufactured in 1961, and our best estimate is that it has been refilled over 250 times. And that's an astonishing fact. And that's a very, very important fact when we are discussing the LPG business with government, with policymakers, and they talk about sustainability. I think we can point to an example like this that says that we are in fact dealing with a very, very sustainable product. We have a cylinder here which has been used over 250 times. It's been recycled, it's been refilled, and it's been emptied 250 times. And we're not talking about the product here, we're talking about the packaging. So we have a very, very strong, powerful message. And what we want to do is maintain that and make sure that we can extend that longevity throughout the whole population. That cylinder was a steel cylinder. In the recent past, we've seen some developments of cylinder design, and the guide will go through some of the options when you select a cylinder for your market. What sort of size are you going to have? What sort of shape do you want? The weight is important. And not only that, we then look at the types of valve that go on that cylinder. Is it a top loading valve? Is it a side loading valve? What sort of connection are we going to have? And when we choose for a new market, when we choose the cylinder, we need to look at the possibility of economy of scale. Is there any way we can standardize cylinders? And that gives you some advantages with filling plants and so on. So the very beginning of the journey on a cylinder is very much to do with the size, the shape, the weight, the valve, and what it's going to look like. Then we get into the technical aspect of the design of the cylinder, and this is a typical design. This would be a two-piece cylinder. All cylinders start off their life in a flat plate form. They are the top and the bottom of the cylinder are pressed out as circles, and they're pressed into a conical shape like that, and into a cylinder. They're welded, and you can see here. This is an interesting point to make. The base of the cylinder, the foot ring, if you like, is recommended to be slightly bigger than the cylinder itself. And why is that? Well, when the cylinders are interacting on a filling plant conveyor, they are not touching each other on the cylinder itself. They're actually making contact on the base. So having the base slightly bigger than the cylinder diameter actually gives some sort of protection of the main cylinder itself. So there's a conversation to be had at this point with the cylinder manufacturers, and we're going to bring in a cylinder manufacturer shortly. But these are the sort of conversations that you're going to have. What size is it going to be? What diameter? What height? What sort of valve are we going to have? And so on. The manufacturing of the cylinder itself, this is a photograph that was taken during the manufacturing of a cylinder. These are the top half of a cylinder. This one, I think, was about 5 or 6 kilogram. And you can see that you've got the top half of the cylinder with the handle and the boss that's welded into the top, the bung, where the valve will be screwed. So this is halfway through the manufacturing process. And you can see there's some welding that's been done. So the sort of questions that the guide talks about is the narrative, the discussion that you're going to have with the cylinder manufacturer about the manufacturing process itself. Not just how it's made, but also how are we going to paint it? How are we going to protect it from corrosion? And what about the internal cleaning of the cylinder before we receive it? So these are all questions that you have with the cylinder manufacturer. And this is elaborated in more full detail in the guide itself. Then once the cylinder's been made and manufactured and submitted into the market, it is then entering into the service. And this is where the cylinder gets involved with cylinder filling plant operations. So we're looking at the cylinder inspection prior to filling, the filling of the cylinder itself, and also the post-filling procedures and checking for leaks. So a good deal of information in the guide on the cylinder filling. And then this is a very important topic, the maintenance and repair and requalification. That cylinder, and not all of them will last 60 years, but if you can spend a great deal of attention and care on the maintenance, repair, inspection, and requalification, these cylinders get requalified depending on the country they're operating in 10 years periods or 5-year periods. And you can then examine the way cylinders are maintained and repaired and requalified. And then you can ensure that whatever you do, you make sure that you can do all you possibly can to sustain that cylinder in circulation as long as you possibly can. comment there on the repair of valves. People often ask me about the valves being repaired in some countries. Valves are taken out of the cylinder, and if they're leaking, they're repaired on site. This is something that we would not normally condone. The reason for that being is that if you're dealing with a valve that's being repaired, how do you know that it's been repaired? And do you know who's repaired it? And how do you know that it is the valve that was put in there in the beginning? So the repair of valves is something that we don't recommend. And instead, we recommend a replacement program. And the cost of the valve, a lot of the valve cost is actually in the metal itself, in the brass. And very often you can have a recovery of waste metal through the valve that's been recovered. Finally, when the cylinder reaches the end of its life, there has to be an assessment as to whether it's repairable or whether we look at scrapping the cylinder and buying new. And in that situation, it's very, very important that the cylinder is completely gas-free. Even a vapor in the cylinder when it's empty is an explosive mix. So we are looking at completely gas-freeing the cylinder before we destroy it. And when the cylinder is destroyed, we have to make sure that it is completely destroyed and there is no possibility of the cylinder re-entering the market. Very often we hear stories of cylinders that have been scrapped in one country and reappearing in another. And if they've been scrapped in one country, they're not fit for purpose, and they certainly won't be fit for purpose in another country either. So when those cylinders are scrapped, there has to be a record made of the cylinder itself, the reason why it's being scrapped, take a note of the serial numbers, and where that scrapped cylinder has been disposed of. And interrogate the reasons why that cylinder had to be scrapped to try and minimize future scrapping. So this is all information that's included in the guide. And then at the back of the guide, we've got an appendix, several appendices, where we talk about various things such as description of the defects. And these photos here show you some of the defects that we can have. And these are pointed out as an example. Very often at a cylinder filling plant, there will be photos like this in evidence so that people can actually quantify the damage and determine whether it's okay or not okay. And if it's not okay, then what procedures can we apply to repair that cylinder if we possibly can? And that can be with cold working or with hot working. And there's some narrative in the appendices about that and when to do that. So these are the main topics in the guide to cylinder management, and I think it's 60 or 70 pages thick. So I've gone through it very quickly, but it just gives you an idea of what information is in there and what you can do to try and extend the life of the cylinders and make sure that they are continued in circulation, fit for purpose. So I want to stop now, and I'll stop sharing so that we can have a bit of a discussion because I've got, as I said earlier, I've got one or two people who have got skin in the game, if I think they call it, very much involved in the cylinder business. And the first person I want to bring in is Mohammed Shamas from Sigma Cylinders. And this is a company in Lebanon that actually makes cylinders. And I had a brief discussion with Mohammed earlier today. And my question to Mohammed is, what can you do to ensure that the cylinder that you make is going to last a long time, say 30 years? So Mohammed, it's probably a question that you get asked frequently at the same time as being asked, and by the way, make it as cheap as possible. So how do you respond to that sort of question, Mohammed?
David, thank you for the question. So talking about LPG cylinders and how we manufacture them, it's ensuring that LPG cylinder manufacture at Sigma Cylinders that exist, by the way, in Lebanon, Ivory Coast, and Ghana. So we are in African countries, West African countries. Last up to 30 years, as you have asked, involves a comprehensive approach that considers many stages of production to end user handling. Because the thing is that everyone thinks that a cylinder manufacturer is the only one responsible for the cylinder, but we've learned it the hard way. So it's been 25 years in the market. We really understand now different countries, different handling of cylinders, different environments for cylinders, because you were talking about finishing and painting as well. So today, if I want to go over the approach, I would start with the design. So designs, usually we all follow a standard in design, but usually we work on durability features. So we design our cylinders with features that sometimes enhance the durability, like having a reinforced collar handles and thick foot rings, as the drawing that you have showed, the drawing that you have showed a thickness of 9 millimeters, which is actually a thickness that no one would accept to pay for, let me say, because usually it's around 2.0 to 3.0 millimeters in most of the countries that we're selling to. So even in material consideration, specifically in regions like Africa, because today I'm going to be talking about Africa and Lebanon, West Africa and Lebanon, third world countries, handling conditions can be tough. So we consider always increasing the steel thickness, and that's what we did in Lebanon. We succeeded with the government to increase the thickness to 3 millimeters to provide extra protection. However, this comes with an added cost. That's what you were mentioning. That often isn't supported by marketers and consumers. I really thank you for having Rafael with us on the line. He's one of the best negotiators I've ever dealt with. So following that, another approach that we follow is adherence to the standards. So we strictly adhere to international and regional standards on cylinders, ensuring that the cylinders meet or sometimes exceed the required safety and quality benchmarks by testing and all other quality processes that we follow. This actually is essential for long-term durability. Third in our approach is usually the manufacturing quality control. So our manufacturing process includes rigorous quality control at every stage. So this ensures that each cylinder is built to last, with checks on weld integrity, material strengths, overall durability, inbound, outbound, all of the factors inside the manufacturing process. So one of the things that you have mentioned is the protective finishing, and I've seen it in your slides. You've had zinc-based metallization, which is something very important, environmentally unfriendly, just so we can highlight this. So we do apply protective coatings. Some clients come to us and we want zinc metallizing, and at the same time they request from you an ISO certification for environment. So they don't work together. Still, zinc-based metallizing is a bit expensive. It's not as cheap as people think. It can cost up to $2 per cylinder, $1.5 per cylinder. But yes, it does prevent the cylinder from corrosion, and it extends the lifespan of all cylinders, especially in harsh environments. Like when we talk about West Africa, where humidity is so high, being on the Atlantic Ocean, you need something to protect the cylinder. But still, even with this zinc-based metallization, the handling of the cylinder and the storing of the cylinder is not up to that. Like whatever you do, if you don't handle it right, it's going to get ruined. So following that, we talk about the components that you have mentioned, David. So yes, the bungs and the valves in cylinder manufacturing are very important. That's why we all the valves and bungs that we use are sourced from reputable suppliers, and I think there are only 2 or 3 reputable suppliers in the business today that are actually maintaining the integrity and safety of a valve and the bung. Packaging as well is very important pre-transportation. So we do use protective packaging, which is today is the nets. So the distance that you mentioned regarding the foot ring, the distance between the cylinder, usually it can be done through nets with a certain thickness that can protect cylinders from touching each other on a conveyor. Life cycle considerations, David, which is important. It's important to recognize that cylinders' lifespan is influenced not just by the manufacturer, but also by how it handles through its life. Transportation, for example, from our plant to the marketer. The cylinders must be handled carefully to avoid the damage. filling plant handling. Marketers must maintain strict quality control at filling plants to prevent damage and ensure safety, because I'm sure a lot of people with us are familiar with what I'm saying, but the way cylinders are actually offloaded, the container or the truck, into a filling plant or into any distributor, any retailer is something that you can never imagine. And actually, we've worked on many awareness campaigns that we can share with you guys in Ghana and then Ivory Coast on how to deal with cylinders, because I wish I can describe it the right way, but you have a guy standing on the top of the truck, pushing the cylinders with his leg, so all the cylinders can fall on the ground at the filling plant. So the distributor handling as well is like, when the cylinders are with distributors, proper handling is again crucial to avoid damage. So following that, today you're talking as an end consumer, David, you're talking that you want your cylinder to last for 30 years. But in a CRM, which is the cylinder recirculation management or model, cylinders are often swapped between consumers. You know that. So this means the condition of a cylinder depends on how a previous user was handling it, adding more complexity to maintaining, the long-term durability that you're talking about.
Yeah, Mohammed, thanks.
So
thanks. You raise a number of points there. I'll come back to you in a minute, but I want to bring in, you mentioned the distributor there. I want to bring in distributor, Rafael Cotton from Oryx in South Africa. Rafael, you're very much in the game. You own cylinders, you handle cylinders, and you supply them to consumers. So what are your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you, David, and thank you, and welcome to the listeners. I want to start off by just looking at why a cylinder is required for a wholesaler, what's the importance of it. And I want to mention that, a cylinder is not sold by most wholesalers. Oryx doesn't sell it to the consumer. It's used more as a transport of gas, so you move it from one point to the next. So it's very important to ensure that this cylinder, as mentioned, there's no income that comes from the sale of the cylinder. It's a deposit method. So it's very important to maintain the cylinder and ensure that it comes and rotates, as you mentioned. The cylinder itself is one of the few commodities that the packaging is more than the goods. So it's not something we're going to use and throw away. We reuse it. So we want to ensure that these cylinders come back and gets refilled, and we need to make sure that's maintained. So there's two types of cylinder maintenance that I could think of. One is a legal requirement. As you mentioned, there's a periodic cylinder and valve testing that's required. And a second is more from a company perspective, where they want to do maintenance to maintain the cylinder quality and also the visual look, so the aesthetics of it. And I'm not going to discuss about the legal requirements or the aesthetics, but more how does a wholesaler preserve, or what's the benefit to preserve the cylinder and prolong the life? Very important. Mohammed was talking about the different aspects and the cost of the cylinder. And I want to, it's quite funny when someone wants to put down or become a wholesaler or a distributor, and they want to put a bulk depot down in a refilling site, they always look at the capex, the capital investment on the actual depot. But they forget that, the biggest capex that you're going to invest in is actually the cylinders. And one cylinder doesn't look so expensive, but if you multiply that by multiples, you start investing, and it depends how much, 100,000 to 1 million or whatever it is, number of cylinders, it becomes a significant capital investment. So we need to, this capital investment that you put into the market, you need to make sure there's the return of this investment. There's a good ratio, or a nice ratio that we use in the industry, is called the cylinder turnaround ratio, CTR, which calculates basically the number of times a cylinder is sold to the market. So, or you could say refilled. And I'll take a typical example in South Africa, a 9 kilogram, which is commonly used. Let's assume that it gets rotated or refilled 5 times in a year. So the CTR of this is 5, and let's assume that it lasts, 10 to 15 years on average. But it's hard to estimate that because a cylinder can come in within the first month. I've seen a cylinder get scrapped, or as you mentioned, there were cylinders that was there from 1961. I've seen cylinders from in the 1960s as well in the market. So there's a lot of it's hard to predict how long a cylinder will last, but assuming we work on 15 years, so we got a CTR of 5 in 15 years. So that means that specific cylinder, as an example we're taking, is going to be rotated through its lifetime 75 times. So you need to ensure the cost of the cylinder, the depreciation, and the maintenance of that cylinder covers the times it's going to be filled into that 75 times the margins you make out of it. Otherwise, you're going to reduce the investment, so the return on investment won't make sense. And if you don't manage the cylinder through this process, it won't give you that return of investment. So I want to go into the life of the cylinder, or the handling of the cylinder itself. And Mohammed mentioned it, and I think he also mentioned, David, is that there's a lot of points of movement. So if you think about the cylinder being filled at a depot, there's a super dealer or distributor comes and collects it or gets delivered to them, that there's some handling that happens from the distributor or reseller, super dealer side. There's a reseller to a point of sale. So that's a typical, call it, supply chain of the cylinder from the filling to the point of sale. And then as a consumer, you'll come with your vehicle, your car, your whatever your motorbike, whatever you have, to come and collect it, and you'll take it to your house, you'll use it, move it and connect it, and the same cycle happens backwards. So this cylinder has, for the example we said, the 75 times through its life cycle, it moves through all these points, and sometimes a few more points that it goes to and gets handled. So you could understand the points of connection, the points of movement, the knocks, the falls that these cylinders could have. And if the cylinder is not looked after during this process and procedure, if the inspections are not done when it's received by the plant, if the training is not done on how to handle the cylinder, if there's no, for example, rubber mats that's placed. And if you think about a typical 48 kilogram cylinder in South Africa weighs around 42 kilograms. So you've got a 90 kilogram cylinder that you're trying to maneuver. So if you don't have tail lifts, if you don't have forklifts, it's going to be very hard to make sure this cylinder is placed nicely onto the ground. I don't know about you, but I'm not that strong. But yeah, so there's a lot of process and procedure that needs to follow to make sure that we don't shorten the life of the cylinder. And by shortening, as you mentioned, it's rejection of the cylinders when they get inspected, and there's ways of scrapping. It's cheaper to maintain the cylinder, to do some maintenance, than replace the cylinder. And I want to go just through a few points of when a cylinder is scrapped, and it's just to dwell in quickly. When it bulges, that's a point. It's a swelling of the cylinder, and that's mainly due to overfilling. It needs to be scrapped. Dents. So if the depth, and there's different calculations, but if the depth exceeds 25% of its width, it needs to be scrapped. And one common method, the reason why we scrap cylinder, is a well dent. Now, the well dent is generally on the foot, the foot ring connected to the actual cylinder. And as I mentioned, the 90 kilogram cylinder gets dropped. So if that's not maintained and not managed, you're going to shorten that life cycle of that cylinder, and you're going to scrap it. The other methods or reasons for rejection is cut or a gouge. Now, if you can calculate this, fantastic. If it's less than the original calculated wall thickness, then you have to scrap it. But generally, if there's a cut or gouge, that gets scrapped. If there's a crack in the cylinder, fire damage, so if there's no training or explaining how to use it, how to check your regulators, that's generally where a lot of fires happen at households. That gets scrapped. Corrosion, there's different levels of scrapping a cylinder due to corrosion. So all in all, all these process of rejection shortens the life of the cylinder. and becomes very expensive to maintain for a wholesaler. So I want to conclude, to manage cylinders safely in order to preserve the asset and prolong the life of the cylinder, so it can be filled many times. Number one, safety management practices, not overfilling the cylinder, avoid physical damages. Cylinders needs to be stored and transported correctly. We need to adhere to industry safety standard regulations. So if you minimize the risk of accidents, which could lead to financial penalties as a wholesaler, reputational damage, or even legal liabilities. And doing all this, there's doing proper cylinder management and making sure the cylinder is prolonged. It demonstrates also RX commitment to safety. This builds trust with customers. It demonstrates safe and reliable cylinders. And I know we all talk about ESG, and there's a whole drive about ESG. If you think about the environmental impact, if you prolong the life of the cylinder through safe management practices, that also it has a very good environmental impact. Few cylinders need to be manufactured. You don't have to replace the scrap cylinders, and reducing the environmental impact is associated with production and recycling of the cylinder, of the process. So therefore, managing your cylinder safely will preserve the asset and prolong the life of the cylinder, which ultimately, and this is generally what we look at, it will save money for the wholesaler. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Raphael. Yeah, very interesting. And what I want to do is we've talked about the manufacturer, we've talked about the distributor. Morten, I want to bring you in here as a representative of the filling plant equipment manufacturing industry, and get your perspective on this whole question of cylinder management and maintaining the fit for purpose of a cylinder going through your plants. What steps can you do to protect the cylinder as it's going through the plant to be refilled and checked, and both before and after filling?
Hello, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. I'm on a bit of a bad connection here. Actually, on vacation, I came down from the mountains to look at watering hole to join a meeting. If it's too bad, I can ask one of my colleagues.
Yeah, it's very hard. There's quite a lot of noise in the background.
I'd like to have exactly. Not so much I can do about it. Is it doable, or should I ask Marcel to take over?
Well, carry on if you can, and we'll see how we go.
Yeah. No, okay, just for a short opening. So the importance of the cylinder management, as stated from the gentleman before, cannot be underestimated. And we can do much in terms of equipment to help this, both in the right way of handling and to resolve the problems that might come. But if there isn't a will and a motivation to do so, really manage all the cylinder handling, it won't help to have, you can invest as much in equipment as you want to. And of course, the most critical points, as mentioned before, is to come from the distribution into the filling plant, and from the filling plant into the distribution. Those areas where you have to handle a lot of cylinders from automated filling line, for instance, into a truck. And again, we can only recommend that the use of cages or transport pallets in order to avoid the bulk handling of cylinders, which can be very, very damaging to the cylinders.
Yeah, and I guess also there's the risk of injury as well. We haven't talked about that. We talk about the cylinder itself and the damage that the cylinder might get going through a manually handled operation, but there's also the risk of cylinders dropping on people's feet and fingers getting crushed as well. So I guess minimizing manual handling on your filling plants is probably something you look at carefully.
Definitely a win-win, because you reduce the damages to the cylinders, and you improve your economics for the workers that you have. So, yep. It's another aspect of safety, not directly related to the cylinder itself, but the overall safety, economics, and
right.
What else? Yeah.
And Yeah,
Go ahead.
go on. No, go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you about palletizing. How common is palletizing these days?
It's quite common, I would say. I don't know if we can say in terms of volume of cylinders. Unfortunately, there are some of the bigger markets where there are many cylinders in distribution, like Brazil or India, that are not palletized, and where we are, of course, as you know, we're looking at other solutions with partners in the markets to avoid all the manual handling. And other than that, I would say it's like a maturity, market maturity measurement. That the more mature the market is, the more likely it is to be working with pelletized cylinders.
Right. Okay, Morten, thanks ever so much. I know that you're in the middle of your holiday, and I'm not quite sure where you are, but thanks for coming in.
I'm at the foot of the Pyrenees, in the mountains between Spain and France.
Right, enjoy. Thanks very much.
But I'm available, and again, if it's too bad the quality, you can call in Lars Sellis on the meeting. He can answer questions just as well as I can.
Right. Well, if we get any questions in the chat box about filling plants and handling through filling plants, we'll refer them to you. But in the meantime, we'll let you get back to your holiday. And thanks ever so much for joining, Morten. Really appreciate it. And now I want to move across to the Philippines, because I was actually in the Philippines last week, and I had a very enjoyable couple of days working with Mercy Pastrana, who's the head of the Philippines LPG Association. And we had a discussion while I was there about what the Philippines government have finally done, which is to introduce a gas act covering the storage, handling and distribution of LPG. And what I want to do is bring Mercy in. Can you hear me, Mercy, first of all?
Yeah, David, good. Hello.
Great to hear from you again. So my question is, in the context of what's happened in the Philippines, because I know for years you had no real legislation in place, and now you have it. And I know that it was something that was worked very, very closely with the industry. Your discussions with the industry on this, I know, went on for years. And then I think it was enabled last year, if I'm not mistaken. And what difference do you think this legislation has made to the way the industry operates, and in particular to the cylinder business?
Yeah, thank you, David. The Philippines has been suffering from bad and illegal practices for many years after the oil deregulation was passed in 1998. Some of these illegal activities are underfilling, cross-filling, and even the use of chop-chop or dilapidated cylinders. Finally, in October 2021, the government approved the new LPG Industry Regulations Act. We call it LIRA for short. This new act governs the whole sector of the LPG industry, from refinery down to the retail level. And what's important in this new regulations is the introduction of so many other issuances that governs the distribution, retail and distribution of LPG cylinders, including the refilling, and of course the steep penalties that goes with the violations. With this improvement or regulations, we have for the past 2 years we have seen some improvements, not only in the retail market distribution, but in the cylinder quality as well. This year, we have started this cylinder exchange and swapping program. This program involves the creation of a task force that will monitor and operate a cylinder swapping center. This will be a private initiative, but overall it will be under the directives of the Department of Energy, co-chaired by the DTI. And this aspect, all those cylinders or captured cylinders by companies that were not able to swap all the shares will be brought in the swapping center that will be like a clearinghouse, wherein all dilapidated, uncertified, or unchecked cylinders will be brought to requalification or repair facilities, and those scrap will already be condemned so that it will not be recirculated in the market. All these activities will be through the efforts, concerted efforts of the LPG associations, the industry, and of course, through the directives of the government. For the past 18 years, we have tried to work these LPG regulations, and we are very happy that after all these 18 years, finally we have these regulations, and we hope that in the coming years, we will see a lot of improvements in our LPG industry in the Philippines, not only in the consumer safety and value for money, but including the business aspect, which of course involving the cylinder management. During the prior to the passing of the law, there are a lot of illegal refillings that affect of course, the owners of the cylinders were deprived of the use of their own cylinders because of these illegal refillers use their cylinders without their authority, and thus without proper inspection during, let's say, the mandatory or periodic testing requirement. Thus, after the passage of the law in 2021, we see a lot of old cylinders that were brought back to the refilling plant of the brand owners, and now which are now being under repair and requalification by the service companies. So that's how we will see that because of this regulation, there will be a lot of improvements. And I think with the concerted efforts of all of the LPG associations and the industries and the government, in the next years to come, you will see a lot of improvements in the Philippine LPG industry.
That's great, Mercy. Thanks very much for that. And I noticed, I did have a look at that gas law that came through the Philippines government. And one of the things that jumped out of the pages was the fact that if you are caught doing illegal practices in the Philippines, ultimately you can go to jail. And I know this was something that I know has been happening in Brazil for many, many years. But non-compliance to the law results in heavy penalties, and that does have an impact. So whenever I talk about legislation and the introduction of legislation into a country, we always talk about, yes, we need strong legislation, which is what you've got now, but on top of that, we also need very strict penalties for non-compliance. And I was very pleased to see that, and I know you've been lobbying for that over the years as well. So it's good news, and we'll watch closely, Mercy, as we move forward. And it looks like the Philippines LPG industry is starting a new chapter, which is great to hear. So
yeah, thank you, David. Yes,
thanks for that. And also, I know it's late in Manila. I think it's what is it, about 8 o'clock at night? So
it's about 9 o'clock in Manila.
Is it? Oh, terribly sorry, keeping you up too
That's
late.
okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I know there are some representatives attending from Philippines because I send all your link to some of our colleagues here in the industry. Excellent.
Well, they're all doing a great job now, and we look forward to that moving forward. So thanks again for joining us today, Mercy. We really appreciate your comments from an association. Very important.
Thank you, David.
I'm getting some questions coming through the chat box that I've answered one or two, and let me try and go through them now because we've only got about 10 minutes left. So from Pancras Aber, currently there are metered LPG gas connections to homes. What is the availability of calibration of these meters? Well, a good example of this is actually in Japan. In Japan, you will find outside the home 2 cylinders, one active and one standby, and the gas is going through the hole, through the wall into a meter, and the customer never sees the cylinders. The cylinders are replaced periodically when they're emptied by the distributor. And the meter itself, it's a good question about the calibration of the meter, because when the meter is installed, the meter actually reads the amount of gas the customer has taken. So the point of transfer occurs at the meter. So the meter then is determining how much gas the customer's used. And the question that you've asked about the calibration of the meters, I think we'll have to double check with Japan on that, because it may well be that that's a role that the distributor takes, even though they don't normally go inside the building. But we'll check on that, Pankras, and come back to you. Christoph, good to hear from you. Could you talk about what can be done to reduce cylinder leakage? Are we talking here, Christoph, about, I don't know whether we can bring you into this discussion. Are we talking here about leaking cylinders at a filling plant when they come? And I think there's an allowable limit as to how much a cylinder can leak. Is it the amount of cylinder LPG that's being lost in the cylinder during the distribution? Is that it?
And what I was actually looking for is the loss of cylinders as such. What can you do to avoid cylinders leaving distributors, etc.?
Okay, so this is the loss of the cylinder, not the product. Okay, and that really is an interesting question, because it's a question that was put on that Slido poll about tracking cylinders, and how can we monitor the cylinder population out there? Are there ways in which we can do that? And I think in the last 10 years, digitalization has allowed us to apply all sorts of tracking devices on small assets. When I say small assets, low-cost assets, which previously was prohibitive. Before the cloud, before the internet cloud, all the data had to be stored on the device, which made the device very expensive, 2 or 3 euros. But now what the devices can do is transmit to the cloud, so that the amount of information on the tracking device is minimal, which brings the unit cost down. So I think what we're seeing is a move over the last 10 years towards tracking of cylinders using digitalization techniques, and making that the way to do that cheaper, to the point where you can actually now start thinking about putting it onto smaller cylinders. And I know companies like Amtrol Alpha in Portugal, they're developing this technology with their brand new cylinders. And that, I think, is when you need to do it. To try and retrofit is an extremely expensive task. But I think the answer, Christoph, is that the technology is there. It's getting better and better. And hopefully we'll see, certainly for new markets, I think there's an opportunity to have this tracking device on the new cylinders as they enter the market from the very beginning of their lives. So I've got a question here from Elvis Medard. Pressure testing the valve of the cylinder at a normal working pressure of the LPG inside a cylinder, is that okay for reusing the valve? I think the answer to this is that when you are monitoring cylinders going through the filling plant, and Morten probably will support this, is that the leak detection is actually done at cylinder pressure. You know, we're not exerting anything more than cylinder pressure. We're putting soapy water on the valve, observing for bubbles, and if there are bubbles, then it's leaking, and then we have to determine whether that is an excessive leak or not. So I think your question about pressure testing the valve at normal working pressure is perfectly okay. That would be my answer. But Morten, if you disagree with me on that one, then jump in.
I believe the question is more to the valve itself, whether it is. You mentioned in your slides that you do not recommend reworking, refurbishing the valves. If the question goes to what you are answering, yes, then I concur. But I'm not sure the question goes in that direction.
Okay, I see what you mean. So we're talking here about refurbishing valves, which, as you say, it's not something that we support. We don't recommend that because, well, I think the simple reason is that if you're a valve manufacturer and one of your valves has been repaired and you had nothing to do with that at all, then how can you honestly give some sort of guarantee to that? Mohammed, you've got a hand up. and you're muted.
So, David, just because that's part of our manufacturing process, because we test the cylinder before the valve is there, so we tested it with the water pressure first, and then it goes into something called pneumatic test after the valve is screwed into the cylinder. So usually when we want to test this valve, we test it way above the normal pressure or working pressure of LPG. So usually it goes up to 12 bars of pressure of air.
Okay.
Just to answer this.
Okay, well,
Yep.
Thanks very much for that. So I hope that's answered the question for Elvis. And then one more, then we'll have to start wrapping up. The question about using propane butane mixtures in countries like Africa. It's perfectly common to do that. Typically, we've got mixtures in Asia, anywhere between 50-50 and 80-20 butane rich. And the reason for that is that butane has a much higher vapor pressure, boiling point, sorry, than a much higher boiling point than propane, which boils off at about -40. So typically you'll see propane used in very cold countries and butane mixtures used in tropical countries. Let me just see if we can get one more question answered here. What are the maintenance requirements of composite cylinders? Very good question from oh, I've lost the name, but it's just jumped off the bottom. But it's a very good question because composite cylinders can be damaged, and they can be damaged with very little visible sign of damage. So the maintenance of composite cylinders is one that has to be done very, very carefully, and discussing with the manufacturer, I think, is the best policy there. We're going to have to start to wrap up. So what I'm going to do, if I can, is to let me just see whether I can do this. I'll move over to a screen share. I'm getting alerts for another meeting that I've got in 5 minutes, so we'll ignore that for a second. And let me just jump back now to the original presentation that I put up and get back onto full screen if I can. And there we are. I think we're now sharing full screen. So what we talked about at the beginning was the poll. And what I'm now going to do, if I can, is to move back to the QR code. And I think what I can do here on my phone, I think I can then open up another poll. So this poll, if you can jump onto the Slido app again, using this QR code, and you will see another question that's jumped up on the polls. How useful did you find this webinar? So it's a pretty straightforward question. Was it very useful? Was it quite useful? Or was it not useful at all? So for those of you that are still with us, if you can vote, please, on that. I got 6 or 7 people already doing that. Thank you very much. So we'll give it a couple of minutes, and then we'll go to the next question. This is so important for us because we need to move forward and plan. And the next couple of questions will be very, very useful for us in doing that. So 23 people so far responded. I'll give it another couple of minutes, and then we'll see whether we can move over to the next question. So the next question is, would you be interested in attending similar webinars in other subjects? So stick on that poll and you should see another question come up. And again, thank you all for joining. And we're over 25 already. So I think you've got the hang of this Slido poll now, which is, I use it a lot. It's very, very useful. It's a very good interactive tool. And it's certainly very helpful. And what I will do, I will feed this back to you once we get all the results in. So close that poll off. And then this is a very important one for us. This is, what other subjects would you be interested in? Now, I've listed a few here. I've got 3, 4, 5. I've got about 8 different topics. So I'll leave this up for a little while because what I'd like you to do is have a look through those topics and just select one of them that you think might be of interest in the future? This is the last question I'm going to ask. So, and thank you for your response. It's pouring through. I've got 16 people already, and it's very, very useful feedback, this feedback, because we are going to be planning future webinars like this if it's a positive feedback, and this gives us an idea as to what topics we can I'll leave that going for a minute while I wrap up. So thank you all very much again for joining this webinar. I'll stop sharing now. Before I do stop sharing and say goodbye, I just want to say thank you for joining. Cape Town is our LPG Week event coming up in November, and it's under the heading, the theme, Energy for All. And I can assure you that cylinder business will be very much in the focus for that. So save the date. My email address is at the bottom right-hand corner. If you've got some follow-up questions, then please get on to me through that. And finally, with a couple of minutes over time, but just once again, thank you all for joining. Thanks for your participation, and for the contributions from Mohammed, Rafael, Morton, and Mercy, particularly, and for Christoph. And yeah, look, we'll draw a line under it now, and we'll make sure that the recording for this and the presentation that you've seen gets sent out probably in a few days' time. Tamsin's going to be involved in that, so I better check with her first. And if there's any other outstanding questions, we'll come back to you through the chat box separately. So I think that's all. Unless anybody has anything to add, then I'll say thank you very much again for joining, and keep safe. Thank you. Goodbye.